Welcome to London. It's a few too many polygons for my liking.
That's more like it. Yes, in what is definitely a useful and interesting video, and not a thinly disguised excuse to spend a spare day wandering around central London, I am going to cover the angry game reviewer classic of pretending to be disappointed when a 20-odd-year-old game does not manage to exactly replicate real life. Also, because it's me, I might take a look at how it does achieve whatever level of accuracy it does manage to pull off. But first, I want to talk about the idea of locality in computer games. I've always been fascinated by computer games which claim to recreate places I've been, whether it's flying over the town where I grew up, or driving a train route that I've spent many hours being a passenger on. There's something special about playing a game where you don't have to take the map out of the box to know where you're going. It's certainly resulted in me buying more than a few mediocre games over the years, just because they had London or UK written somewhere on the cover. Locality for me has two distinct facets: geographical layout and sense of place. Forza Horizon 4 is a great example of the latter. While the map is a series of stitched-together caricatures of bits of northern England and Scotland, it is immediately recognisable from any point of it as the UK. The street signs, the road markings, even the scale of the landscape and the buildings in it, all combine to give this tremendous sense you are driving along a real A road, even if it's one that exists nowhere in reality. Euro Truck Simulator 2 is the opposite. It's geographically accurate, if at a rather condensed scale. You can navigate between cities, simply knowing which roads link them, and which compass direction to head. But in terms of sense of place, well, in lieu of a map update or seeking out the ProMods add-on, you're driving along generic dual carriageways to generically European cities that may as well be Rotterdam, or anywhere. Possibly the better example here would be a flight simulator which features a totally accurate road grid for any UK city you fly over, but then fills it with wooden bungalows and salt box houses from the rural US. I just wanted to get in my usual plea for SCS to rework the UK map once they're done with Germany and Austria. Midtown Madness 2 does attempt locality in both of these senses, within the constraints of the technology of 2000. While the city is noticeably condensed, there were points when I found myself driving along and saying things like, "Oh, this is Lower Thames Street. If I turn around, I could drive up along Victoria Embankment, then across the river and down past Waterloo," and finding that this did, most of the time, work. Although the map does get geographically confusing around the edges. With this road that looks like Bishopsgate, but follows the road of Commercial Street. But in saying that said road reminds me of Bishopsgate, I also reveal just how good this is at sense of place. I'd argue that Midtown 2 is at its best, when you're not near any of the low-polygon approximations of landmarks, and instead are just trundling down the generic streets connecting them. The building facades look like London buildings. The road markings are London road markings. The streets are suitably narrow, including the little alleyways around the city. And while textures do repeat, they are used carefully enough to give different parts of the city a representative architectural feel, from towers around Old Street to squat functional buildings south of the river. The traffic is not so good. While there's the occasional red bus to denote London, it's very obvious many of these are the same vehicles from Midtown Madness Chicago the year before, and even some of the newer ones do look rather US-centric. The same goes for the occasional rather out-of-place roadside prop. And, worst of all, I spotted a Corporation of London bin in Kensington. Literally unplayable. For anyone wondering, that crest is something you'll only find attached to street furniture in the square mile which makes up the City of London proper. And if you didn't realise the internet has entire sites dedicated to the different types of bollard you'll find in that tiny area, well, you do now. One amusing feature is the ability to drive through the tube, which the free roam practically begs you to do with one of the spawn points facing directly into a station. It is rather less claustrophobic down here than it is in real life, even if you charitably interpret these as cut and cover tunnels rather than deep level tube lines. An important distinction on the tube. Earlier lines, such as the District and Metropolitan, were built by digging up the surface, laying tracks in the resultant trench, then covering it up again, resulting in wider tunnels and therefore bigger trains, and routes which noticeably follow the historic road network in places. Later lines, such as the Piccadilly and Bakerloo, were built much deeper underground, using a tunnelling shield and no need to break up the surface above. But this lack of ability to just build a big trench did mean much smaller tunnels than trains. And while we're talking about it, much of the tube doesn't run in channels at all, because this is London, and we love having a city where you can travel on a line called the Underground without going under anything more substantial than a road bridge, but get on sections of a line called the Overground that are very noticeably quite a distance below said ground. Midtown Madness 2 unsurprisingly simulates none of this. Come on man, it's just a fun driving game set in central London. You don't need to divert into details about the tube. Being set in central London, rather than the surrounding sprawl those of us with non-infinite bank balances end up living in, also leads to the weakest part of Midtown Madness 2's map. The landmarks really do show their age. Once you cross that gap from being generally Londony to an object which is meant to be a specific thing, the illusion breaks, and suddenly you're looking at a flat box with a picture glued to the side. Now some of these props are better than others. Tower Bridge is a genuinely decent recreation. The tower itself is recognisable, if a little slab-sided. It's also a lot cheaper to go inside in the game. And Bank Junction is quite impressive for the time, especially with the buildings obscure it on the drive up, just like the real thing. And St Paul's Cathedral is okay. Then the South Bank is entirely missing, which is a particular disappointment to me, as I do like my wanton brutalism and unexpected scuzzy skate park. Great little fact about the Royal Festival Hall. When it was restored, they put the original 1950s signage on the front. The 1960s signage which replaced it stayed on the side facing the river.
The 1950s version is great. It's a font called Stymie Bold Italic, and at one point in the late 50s, practically every single thing in Britain was labelled with this.
Now, I would be remiss if I talked about Midtown Madness and didn't mention mods, and this missing bit of London can indeed be partially fixed with a mod which adds the London Eye. But as you add further west, the problems continue to build, and not only due to delays on the District line. Getting the full splendour of the Royal Parks was always going to be a bit of an ask on such a small map, but Hyde Park has ended up a featureless polygon, with an apologetic puddle in the middle to represent the Serpentine, and an Albert Memorial that appears to have been made out of foil-covered cardboard. But being a little unfair. Janky and low polygon they may be, but it's not like I couldn't immediately recognise the Wellington and Admiralty arches as I drove, well, through them at speed, because even I haven't completely abandoned the madness part of Midtown Madness. Also, complaining that the Royal Albert Hall doesn't look great at 1920 by 1080 is a bit like claiming the special effects from 1970s Doctor Who look more than a bit wobbly on a high-definition TV. Maybe they weren't so great at the time either, but never was anything else, and they definitely weren't intended to be viewed at this resolution. Indeed, when I first played Midtown Madness 1, I did so in software rendering, at a mere 320 by 240, And these landmarks look fine at this resolution. Well, no worse than any of the surroundings do at least. The CRTs were a lot more forgiving of these sharp-edged, pixely graphics. And by the time I got hold of a copy of 2, I did have a proper 3D accelerator. But even then, we're talking a situation where these low resolutions and smeary textures were the norm. Which is a strange feeling, knowing both my feelings now, in retrospect, and my feelings at the time. It always feels weird talking about the idea of constraints when referring to this era of hardware, because it never felt so constrained at the time. Talking about constraints on 8-bit computers is easy. Type hello into a Word document and save it, and that's a 16 kilobyte file already. So you can start to see how only having 32 or 48K total might be somewhat limiting. More to the point, we knew they were limited at the time, and even when we're talking about 16-bit machines in the 286 era, psychologists would worry if you followed 286 with any word other than slow in a word association test. For the late 90s, that felt like an era of possibility and infinite resources. We had 200 MHz CPUs, MMX, dedicated cards for texture mapping polygons, high-speed CD-ROM drives, 1,000 times the memory of those early 8-bit computers with loaded games from tape on. None of us home users considered that these seemingly all-powerful machines were limited by slow bus speeds, weak floating point units, and that even those seemingly magical 3D cards suffered from low fill rates and slow memory speeds. And in part, this was because the game engines at the time pulled a lot of clever tricks to appear more visually impressive than they otherwise might be, and Midtown Madness is no exception. While it's a trivial task to load and display the entire city on a modern PC, nothing in the early 2000s would have been up to sorting and transforming this many polygons at once. So Midtown Madness uses a trick to only transform and sort polygons which are likely to actually appear on screen. Internally, each section of the Midtown Madness map is represented by a block. Blocks are typically small, a section of road, a junction, or a building. Midtown Madness internally has several helper functions to make defining commonly used items easier. For example, roads with pavements, roads with a central divider, and building facades are all supported natively by the engine, and map developers don't have to model the individual polygons making up, say, a curb. The clever bit, though, is at the edges of these blocks. Each edge contains details on which other block, if any, it connects to. So you know that if you draw block 1, and an edge which connects to block 2 gets drawn on screen, you then need to transform the polygons in block 2, and draw those as well. This already gives a decent speed boost. Any edges connecting to other blocks which are outside the field of view don't need to be traversed. And we can figure that out without having to transform or project any of the polygons in those blocks. But doing only this would still be wasting a lot of potential performance. For example, what if we're stopped facing a building? The back of the building, and the roads to either side, connect to other blocks, which in turn connect to more blocks, which go all the way to the edge of the level. But there's no point attempting to draw them, because they're all behind that big building and can't be seen. Angel Studios figured this one out too. For each block, there is a pre-processed potentially visible set, a list of blocks which can, potentially, be seen from this one. Because the selection of which blocks can be in the field of view is already handled by traversing connections from the visible edges, this doesn't need to be calculated per direction or anything like that. It just needs to keep track of which blocks might potentially be visible, so any which definitely aren't can be discarded. This also allows enforcing a maximum draw distance, by simply counting any blocks too far away as not visible. This is a variation of something called a portal engine, because each edge can be thought of as a portal to the next. a technique which turned up as early as Descent, which uses cube-derived sectors, where the open faces of each cube are the portal to the adjacent cube. By doing the expensive operation of computing the portals and the list of potentially visible sectors when building the level, and saving it to be used later, this makes drawing fast, even on relatively slow PCs, helped by Midtown Madness 1 Chicago not having too many places where you could see all the way across the city. Of course, Midtown Madness 2 adds higher system requirements, and introduces San Francisco, whose steep hills mean you definitely do get those city panning vistas. But if you move the camera up into the sky, you can see how much the game is cheating by not drawing things which wouldn't be visible from a ground level perspective. To sum up then, Midtown Madness 2 is technically clever. It is a driving game. It features a city I am very familiar with, even if I'm used to the landmarks being a little more detailed. I spent, as we know from previous videos, many hours driving around Chicago in Midtown Madness 1. So did Midtown Madness 2 account for many wasted hours at the end of my teenage years? Well, no. Partly because I got my copy quite late, and by that point, the 200 MHz era had been utterly destroyed by the race to 1 GHz that followed it. Midtown Madness's blocky world seemed so primitive, when you also had Grand Theft Auto 3 and, less famously, World Racing available on the same computer. At this young age, I didn't have the walk-around familiarity with London that I would later gain from working and living in it. So much of the attraction passed me by, once the novelty of driving on the left with UK road markings wore off. More importantly, I missed something that was true of Midtown Madness 1, but not so much 2. Midtown Madness kind of didn't know what it was going to be. I don't think those of us who bought it did either. The Microsoft name and the city of Chicago was so closely linked to Flight Simulator in the gaming world in the late 90s that many of us assumed Midtown Madness was going to be flight sim for cars, a notion which the restrained packaging and laid-back menus did little to disabuse. And while it injected the occasional voice sample from the McZ world of zaniness, Midtown 1 itself stayed cautiously close to the territory of straight-laced sim gaming. The handling wasn't great, but it was at least plausible. Buses and trucks felt suitably ponderous to drive, and collisions with traffic would stop you quite realistically. Midtown 2, on the other hand, seemed to be much more confident about staking its claim on the arcade side of things. It's a traffic car, and it flies away, like it's made of polished styrene. The police chase you, whether or not you've done anything naughty. While AI awareness was never a strong point of the first game, it feels even more like cars are constantly trying to crash into you whenever you're stopped at a junction in 2. While the idea of driving a London cab or routemaster through the capital sounds fun, it sours a little when you find they do 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds, and handle like a car in any other arcade racer, especially when some other vehicles are given realistic performance. So your black cab is faster than a new Mini Cooper. Which is frustrating for me, because it was never that great at being an arcade game. The new Crash Course feature looks like it should be enjoyable, but too often relies on injecting difficulty with needlessly strict timers that require an absolutely perfect run, even on the simplest tutorial mission. The races are still a bit of decent fun, and they're a challenge, if you don't choose to blast your way through all the early ones by using the Panos Roadster. Might have done that. A bit. In hindsight, coming away with that impression is rather a shame, because Midtown Madness 2 spawned another one of the internet's great modding communities. Perhaps in part because that Portal engine meant it ran well on the kind of low-end hardware that would be handed down to younger relatives, or indeed, in less well-off households, would have been the family computer until well into the mid-2000s. And perhaps also in part because it was a very common OEM disc, bundled with PC hardware at the time, and so there were a lot of copies floating around. But still, 22 years later, it gave me the excuse to dig into the technical details of a more recent than usual game engine, and more importantly, to go out for the afternoon and take a good wander around my city, so at least we have that. If you can call it any sort of conclusion.
Maybe I should just give up. Turn this into the Corporation Bollards channel.